Welcome, everyone. Welcome back to another live stream. It's your host, Danny Dhaiphong. Both Israel and the United States are signaling readiness to escalate war with Iran once again. But if the tens of thousands in the streets during funeral processions in Iran to mourn the scientists, generals, and civilians alike who were murdered by Israel during this last war, Iran is also ready to strike back and poised to do so. But what is the true fallout of this 12-day active war of hostilities? Is the U.S. ready for an all-out war with Iran? And is Iran turning to China to bolster its air power? How will Ukraine factor into U.S. calculations? To discuss all this and more, we have international security affairs expert and geopolitical analyst Mark Sleboda with us. Once again, Mark, it's good to be back with you, my friend. How are you?
Danny, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on the show, and I'm alive. How are you?
Doing all right myself, Mark. Let's talk about what just transpired in the fallout of the U.S.-Israeli war of aggression on Iran. I first want to just bring up what's been going on recently. There is this massive funeral happening for the generals, the scientists, and the civilians who were killed during the 12 days of active hostilities. There's also a lot of coming out about the consequences of the war, the active war of hostilities. And I want to just pull up a map that Iran has shared of all of the places that they struck during their Operation True Promise 3, from the Haifa port, the oil refineries, and of course, key military targets like the Israeli Ministry of War. Israel, though, and the United States have both said that they are ready to do this again, should they, quote unquote, have to. And I just want to play what Donald Trump had to say quickly about this when he was asked recently by the
concludes.
Here we go.
If the intelligence reports conclude that Iran can enrich uranium to a level that concerns you, would you consider bombing the country again?
Without question, absolutely.
And have you had any?
So, Mark, your assessment of the situation, given the developments that transpired during the active phase of hostilities and the fallout afterward.
Okay, so there's a narrative war continuing on from the active phase of the war, and I don't really think this was so much a full-fledged war as another skirmish. I think the skirmish has ended, and we'd go back into another state of tepid hostilities, but just kicking the can down the road until the next phase of the conflict. And indeed, that's exactly the way Israeli generals have spoken, that this just ends one phase of the conflict. The conflict goes on. So clearly they're quite openly and publicly on that page. Right now, the narrative war has everyone declaring victory, right? And by everyone, I mean Iran on one side, and then Netanyahu and Trump, each for their respective narcissistic egos, declaring victory for themselves and their forces in the conflict. In a way, this I think marks a degree of insecurity on all sides, particularly Trump's quite ferocious reaction to statements by the Ayatollah Khamenei in Iran declaring victory from Iran. Like, how dare you? This is our victory, not your victory, right? It was quite childish, quite open like that, and then proceeded once again to make implicit threats against the Ayatollah Khamenei's life, and that he should, basically grovel because Trump showed him mercy, and that's the only reason he's still alive. This was the latest absolutely
saved, yes,
schizophrenic tweet. I mean, we had it's just this series of tweets by Trump truths. I mean, do we really have to call them truths? I mean, can we just? I guess we have to make scare quotes for that. First, I mean, he declared peace and an end to hate, and then like 24 hours later, he's posting a AI generated music video of B-2 bombers bomb Iran to the tune of the Beach Boys' Barbaran, right? An ode evidently to John McCain, who did the same thing decades ago. And refers specifically to the Ayatollah Khomeini in a box, i.e., a casket, a coffin. And what's more, we had the Israeli defense minister openly on TV say that, yeah, we tried to kill him. We missed him in the beginning, and then he went into hiding, and we couldn't find him. We wanted to kill him. We just couldn't. We couldn't find him, which, of course, flies in the face of the Trump narrative, which was the only reason that he's still alive is because of Trump's imperial mercy. So my assessment is that all of the claims of victory are false or at best qualified, right? Both sides showed offensive capabilities and both sides showed weaknesses. Both sides showed extreme weaknesses, for instance, in air defense, right? The Iron Dome, which is actually more a short-range system, more David's arrow and David's sling, which turned out to be more David's boomerang, firing back on itself on several occasions on film. Was clearly not the magic force field that the Israeli and the American people had been led to believe it was. And that while it made interceptions, that it appears that more Iranian missiles were probably getting through than were being intercepted. And that's on top of U.S. THAAD systems, U.S. Patriot systems, U.S. Aegis systems on destroyers, plus the U.S. and the British and the Jordanian and possibly other Arab states' air forces participating. This was a full court press. And what they discovered was it's not enough, and that they were running short, of course, of air defense missiles, desperately short, right? The Wall Street Journal was openly saying 10 to 12 days, and then they're out of the David's Arrow interceptors and the like. On the other hand, the Iranian air defense was clearly hurting as well. We had a revelation from the Washington Post that this was actually planned months in advance, and everything since then, all this diplomacy has been a pretense. It has been part of a game of elaborate deception by both the U.S. and Israel. And that the real reason for this had nothing to do with a non-existent nuclear weapons program or even some new development in nuclear enrichment, but was simply acting before what the Israelis, the military, saw as the closing of a window of opportunity with a weakened Iranian air defense that they expected to be improved by the end of the year. So that was why they acted now. At least that's what is now being claimed that they are saying in the Washington Post. Always take it with a grain of salt when you hear these leaks, because someone wants you to know this for some reason. I don't believe in very many unintentional leaks in Washington, D.C. This is the narrative management is in full play, and nowhere is that more evident with Trump proclaiming that anyone who in the media who questions the absolute total obliteration of anything the U.S. wanted to bomb is unpatriotic and attacking our troops and sleazebags and should be fired, right? And so forth. So, I mean, this is the emperor has no clothes, right? And what's more than that, Trump is like getting right in your face and waving his mushroom dangly bits around and daring you to say that he's not wearing any clothes. I mean, that's the level of just absolutely Orwellian propaganda that is going on in the United States. So with both sides having deficient air defense, the Iranian side already having been weakened, the highway through Syrian airspace opened by the collapse of Syria and the creation of the new Islamic State there under Giuliani. And there are reports of a massive cyber attack in the early hours. Plus, there were internal drone attacks by Mossad operatives on the air defense. There's some evidence that late in the conflict, Iranian air defense began to recollect itself and present more of an opportunity. They took down several heavy strike UCAVs, Hermes, and some other systems that were actually flying in Iranian airspace. But both sides had vulnerabilities in air defense, and both sides had significant offensive capability. For the Iranians, in the long-range strike category, that was aircraft firing standoff missiles, right? For the Iranian side, that was ballistic cruise and supposedly some hypersonic missiles and drones, right? The Israelis were using long-range strike drones as well. So it's like two mid-weight boxers with no defense game whatsoever, just wailing on each other, Rocky Balboa style, to see who goes down first, right? But the obvious assessment being made was, with the amount of damage being done to Israeli military bases, which, okay, that seems something that is slowly leaking out. The Israeli press is starting to acknowledge that now, and that the Iranian missiles were more precise in those strikes than has been admitted. But I think what was probably more was the economic damage that Iranian missiles were doing to Israel. They were shutting down the Iranian economy essentially in total for 12 days. What's more, they targeted the Haifa oil refinery, which provides, energy needs. Provided energy needs for most of Israel. The Haifa port, a major port facility, and several other in economic facilities. The important takeaway is that Israel was rapidly facing economic collapse. They were running out of strike munitions, and they were nearly completely exhausted of an already only partially effective air defense interceptors. And that's why the U.S. stepped in, dropped some bombs, declared victory, and demanded a ceasefire to save Israel. In reality, because it was clear. I mean, everyone knows this. Israel is geared towards short, quick, decisive wars. And that's what they tried to arrange. But it didn't work out that way, right? They didn't get the regime change. The Iranian government survived the initial shocks and the assassination and terror campaign. And then Israel was faced with looking at a war of attrition, a long-term war of attrition, and a long-term, long-range strike war of attrition for the most part. But they weren't prepared for that. The U.S. isn't prepared for that. We've talked about this before, how the U.S.'s Achilles heel in all of these conflicts right now is their paucity of air defense, right? The relative ineffectiveness of the Patriot system, and the fact that they simply can't produce enough interceptors, right? They make something like 550. They're hoping to ramp up to 600 interceptors a year, right? Usually 2 fired at any given target. That doesn't come close to meeting a month's of Ukraine's needs in the current conflict, much less Israel, much less the United States itself, and all of the other states out there using the Patriot system.
Mark, can I read something? I wanted to bring up this data actually in your reaction to it, given what you're saying here. Even Newsweek reported that during this 12 days of the United States supplying Israel with what it needed for the strike, which has been acknowledged now, it was estimated that 15 to 20% of the U.S.'s global THAAD missile interceptor stockpiles were used at an amount of around $800 million US. And they're saying the U.S. is secretly saying this is unprecedented. But your reaction?
Yeah, the THAAD system is right. It specifically targets ballistic missiles on ballistic trajectory, and the production rate of the THAAD missiles, interceptor missiles, they make a couple dozen a year, So not only is that 15 to 20% of the inventory, but I suspect that's 15 to 20% of the THAAD missiles ever made by the United States. So that was their other, and they pulled this in the defense of Israel, and once again, performance issues, and again an absolute production Achilles heel in this regard. So not just the Patriot system, you're right, the THAAD system as well, and the problems with David's sling, David's arrow as well. I think the one takeaway from this we can see quite clearly from the performance of the Iranian air defense system, which the cyber attack and internal attacks and everything, and the Israeli air defense system supported by U.S. air defense systems, is that the only country in the world that we have evidence of that has a real effective, integrated, interconnected, multi-layered air defense and electronic warfare defense network is Russia. Because we've seen that in operation, and all of the U.S.'s Storm Shadows and the European Storm Shadows and Scalps and the U.S. Attackums and everything were quickly rendered not having any operational effect, according to U.S. officials, right? U.S. officials, not according to Russian propaganda. So that's certainly going to be one thing that both sides are going to need to address. And that's why I don't think that we're going to see an immediate resumption of hostilities, is simply because both sides are exhausted, particularly in terms of air defense systems. Now, it has to be said that I think for Iran's attack, unprovoked, illegal, on Israel's unprovoked illegal attack on Iran, their Mossad campaign, their Mossad asymmetric, unconventional, covert operations, whatever you want to call it, was more effective for them and showed more success than their airstrikes did. Now they're calling the decapitation strikes that started off this. They're calling it the Red Wedding. That's the code name, a reference to a scene out of the Game of Thrones TV show, A Storm of Swords book by George R.R. Martin, of a betrayal scene where a wedding, there's a betrayal and a decapitation strike against the Starks, the noble family, and that's how they intended, to begin this, and they did. And in certain areas, it was extremely effective, taking out a great deal of the top leadership of the IRGC. Some of them have shown up now alive, a handful at least, but obviously still, that's why we're having the funerals now. That was long planned and at least somewhat effective. And then their plan for the mass assassination of Iranian nuclear scientists, they called Operation Narnia, after the fantasy kingdom in the old British fantasy author C.S. Lewis's books. So another thing we can take away from is that someone in the Israeli Defense Department who names these things has a real love for fantasy literature, which I kudos. I'm a fan at least for some of that myself. But the other big takeaway, perhaps even bigger than needing to improve their air defense and realistically needing Russian help to improve their air defense, which they turned down, we now know, prior to this conflict, in a truly naive and fatal conceit, is Iran desperately needs to improve their counterintelligence game, right? the penetration of Iranian society in general, the government, the military, the security services, it was big. And it did not amount to the level of regime change, like, doing enough damage to the government to topple it, in part because they underestimated the domestic political support for the Iranian government. It's an evil, tyrannical, extremist religious death cult in the Middle East. And are you sure you're not talking about the Israelis there? Because that's what it sounds like to me. But anyway, that obviously the Iranian people had more support for that religious extremist death cult, which it's not, by the way, than the neocons in the U.S. in the Trump administration, or than the Israelis predicted. So yeah, both sides need air defense reassessment, planning, restocking, the Iron Dome, etc., is not a magic force shield, and Iran clearly showed the vulnerability of Israel. They had a fiction that was maintained as domestic propaganda for their own population, for the American population, about their magic air defense. And it's been found wanting, and it was quickly exhausted. And it must be said that I don't think Iran even began a true saturation they were starting to pace themselves for a war of attrition. Now, another thing that Israel claimed that we don't know yet is, heard Netanyahu directly make the argument that, yes, Iran may have a big stockpile of missiles capable of hitting Israel. I think believe that Netanyahu even talked about 22,000, something that has been circulated on the media. But he says that doesn't matter because Israel had been extremely effective in weeding out the Iranians' launchers, which would have limited their capability to fire back. We don't know about that yet. We don't have any assessment of whether that is true or not. But if that is true, then another flaw, another vulnerability on the Iranian side that needs to be addressed. So both sides were wailing on each other pretty heavily with very little defense. But it was the U.S. and Israel that tapped the mat first, and not only asked for, but demanded a ceasefire. And it has to be kept in mind when you're considering, Iran never should have accepted, they should have kept fighting. First of all, they were hurt too. Second of all, Israel alone, even without the U.S. joining in full, always has escalation dominance. Because if they ever feel truly existentially threatened, or even close to that, because I think Israel's trigger figure is a lot easier than that.
They're very snowflakey.
They just fire nukes. Yeah, they just fire nukes, right?
Right.
I mean, you could say, the rest of the world will hate them. Or the rest of the world outside the West hates them anyway already. I mean, I'm sure they'll take that opprobrium on board if they felt the need to. So it made very much sense for Iran. Iran proved that they can probably win a long-range strike war of attrition against Israel alone, right, if the U.S. doesn't join in on their own, right? Which is already, this is a very new geopolitical phenomenon in the Middle East. This is the first time that, I don't know if you heard the popular TikTok tune, Boom Boom Tel Aviv, that was playing during the week, right? This is the first time the Israelis have experienced this. Not in all the previous wars in the 60s and 70s in the Middle East, not with Hamas, not with Hezbollah. This is new, and there was a big psychological impact. On top of that, the U.S.-Israel asked for a ceasefire first to save Israel, to save their economy, to save face for Israel, etc. The other thing is that the goal here was quite obviously regime change. I mean, they talked about it endlessly in the Western media. I did a show talking about a dozen articles from Politico to The Economist. So they were all saying, yeah, this is all really about regime change. There was no regime change. In fact, I would say it didn't even come close to regime change. If any regime is going to change in the aftermath of this, probably going to be Netanyahu, because he's got some domestic political problems right now. Not that that will be a real regime change, because he'll just be replaced by another Zionist. But, they did not meet their goal in that regard. And more than likely, almost certainly, I would say, they didn't even meet their goal of destroying Iran's nuclear enrichment program. We don't have any proper damage assessment of what damage the massive ordnance penetrators really did against Fordow or not, right? That's going to go a while. But in a way, it's almost moot. Even the International Atomic Energy Agency has claimed that Iran moved most of their enriched uranium and dispersed it in more secret hidden facilities around the country. That even the damage to the centrifuges, etc., may be exaggerated. We'll have to see. But regardless, even then, Iran dismantled their nuclear enrichment program after the JCPOA took effect. And when Trump ripped it up and pulled out, Iran just rebuilt everything in less than a decade. They could do the same easily again. And I don't think they're facing anything near the same. So I consider it that Iran came ahead in points. That's the way, it may be only marginally in military terms, but when you're talking in political terms and expectations on both sides, that becomes more significant. So if you want to call it an Iranian victory, okay, I wouldn't use those words. I would say Iran came ahead in points, which is enough. Secondly, the U.S. and Israel definitely didn't win. They didn't meet any of their war aims, no matter what kind of ridiculous propaganda they may be claiming at this point. We're living in a world when the U.S. and Israeli propaganda is a lot more ridiculous and exaggerating than Iranian propaganda. Just saying. The big losers out of this, the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, which Trump just bombed all over, because under the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, Iran and any other signatory in the world has the right to a civilian nuclear program and nuclear enrichment. And the one takeaway from all of this is the need for a nuclear strategic deterrent against the United States. Take a look at Libya and Iraq and now Iran on one side, and then take a look at North Korea, who developed a nuclear deterrent on the other side, and no one is talking about regime change or attacking North Korea anymore. So there's going to be the internal debate within the Iranian government's factions, which are plentiful, about the necessity of revisiting a strategic deterrent. A real nuclear weapons program is surely going to come to the fore. And myself, as a realist, I would say absolutely, Iran desperately needs a nuclear weapon. Whether the Ayatollah and the other parts of the Iranian government come to that agreement or not, but that already the damage done. And if Iran develops, then there's the question: does Saudi, does Turkey, does Egypt, do other countries in the Middle East? So the nuclear non-proliferation treaty was already on life support. Let's be clear, after Israel and India and Pakistan, and North Korea, but now it's even more so. The other that's on is the credibility of the International Atomic Energy Agency is gone. It was exposed as an organization that had suffered complete institutional capture and weaponization by the U.S. by this absolutely absurd report about something that Iran did more than 2 decades ago, being used to claim that Iran was out of compliance with the nuclear non-proliferation treaty and providing with Israel with another degree of BS, pretext for their attack. And the Iranian government has made clear that they believe that the IAEA not only provided information to the West for targeting of their nuclear facilities, but also for the assassinations of their nuclear scientists and their families. So Iran will never invite the International Atomic Energy Agency again. That's done. They're crying, "Oh, the Iranians aren't answering our phone calls. They're not talking to us." What do you expect? Right? Even Russia, which is usually a pro forma strict appliance with international law and organizations and everything. We're like, well, what do you expect? Russia's like, well, what do you expect after what the IAEA did? Well, not just in Iran, but also their non-statements and non-doing anything in Ukraine, in the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant as well. So they're done with that. So much like we've already seen the OPCW weaponized, now we see it with the IAEA, and now the outcome is that Iran, which had naively been in apparent almost complete compliance and transparency on its nuclear enrichment program, is now going completely dark. And no one, absent on the ground intelligence, will know what they're doing and what they're not doing. Are they going to go after a nuke now or not? We may not know until we see indications of a nuclear test. That's so. Congrats, good job, Trump, good job, Netanyahu. Of course, that only provides them more pretext, and we know that Netanyahu is already going to be banging on Trump's door, saying, "You got to finish the job for us. You got to finish the job for us." But right now, I did not believe that this was going to happen because I knew that the U.S. didn't have enough air defense missiles, and the one thing that it proved with Israeli jumping the gun and to some extent prodding, or, Trump, not that there weren't enough pro-Israeli war hawks within his own administration that were helping, doing the guiding there, but they proved that the U.S. and Israel don't have enough air defense missiles, right, through the course of this conflict, and they had to tap out. So that was stupid. I mean, it was really strategically stupid, and their fantasy ideas about Mossad's, regime change efforts inside in Iran didn't rise to that level. I mean, give them credit; they went on a terror and assassination campaign. Danny? Did you see the article in the Washington Post?
Which
with the leaked audio?
Oh no! Oh, what was the audio referring to again?
It was the audio of a Mossad operative contacting a senior Iranian general.
Yes.
And
yep.
threatening, you flee the country and make a video denouncing your government,
right,
or we'll kill you and your wife and kid, and then provides the details to show they know exactly where they are. And this is just, I mean, it's interesting that this was leaked, and why, because it was almost certainly leaked by Mossad. So they're bragging about it. They're boasting it, right? But this was just one element of a huge campaign that was unrailed, right? And this is the same type of campaign, maybe more headed up by Turkish intelligence, backed up by the CIA and Mossad, but that brought down the Syrian government in a few days, right? The same type, right? They bring up a profile of all the senior political, military, economic figures, then they tailor, right, an outreach. Should it be threats? Should it be blackmail? Should it be bribery and co-option, right? They work up a profile, and they're extremely effective at it. At the end of the day, I would say the greatest share of the U.S.'s success in toppling the Iraqi government, which the CIA immobilized at least half of the Iraqi military forces, commanders ordering their troops to stand down and not to fight this way. Also, Libya at the end, after enduring months of bombing from first the Europeans and then the U.S. joined in with NATO, they were still standing until there was Qatari special forces, commandos going in, and the commander of the Tripoli defenses had been co-opted and stood down his forces and opened the gates to the city. So they win more of their victories with their covert campaigns, with their deception, with this type of unconventional warfare than they do with their all their vaunted high technology and air defense weapons. And this Washington Post video, it not only is it chilling, right? To think they do this, but it's more chilling how the Washington Post is, this was really cunning and daring. They threatened to kill the man's wife and child. And we're completely okay with that because the Israelis are with us and we're the good guys. And anything we do is therefore justified in the greater good. I mean, that's the way they wrote about this. This was a Mossad campaign, a fairly effective, not 100%, but a fairly effective campaign of assassination, including of civilians, of scientists, of their families, of terrorism, of blowing up SOAR networks, and all of these types of things. And it is cheerleaded by the West. They talk about the Iranian Mossad's cunning, about their daring across the Western mainstream media. It is absolutely revolting. This is the type of stuff that they would try to tell you that the number one sponsor of terror, the Iranian government, does. Now, sorry, biggest state sponsors of terror in the world are Israel and the United States, and this just proved it.
Yes.
So,
yeah, and I think one of the things that Iran has been hanging their hats on is the fact that despite these horrific messages that Mossad was sending to Iranian top generals and their families, none of these videos have actually surfaced of them running away and saying, "Hey, take down the regime," and that was huge for Iran. I wanted to ask you, Mark, more about the air defense question, actually, when it comes to what Iran is going to do from here, because you mentioned the IAEA cooperation is shut down. So that's a big move. But also there have been reports, hard to verify them. The national interest is one of the few that is sharing that Iran is going to potentially purchase 40 plus even. I've seen this number, J-10Cs and other Chinese aircraft to bolster their air power. And there's been a lot of talk about the fact that Russia and Iran, that there was delays with air defense systems to Iran, that Iran disagreed with terms. I'm curious on what your thoughts on the next steps for Iran. What are your reaction to these reports, and how does it conform to the next phase of this conflict?
Okay, so I haven't seen the actual national interest story before now, but I've heard these reports on social media, and I looked at them, and there's certainly a possibility they're true. Yeah, I don't see any better sources here in the national interest story either. I have, it's possible, right? But it's also possible that this is pure disinformation for whatever purposes. I can't verify this. I have no evidence of this. The J-10 is a good aircraft, but so is the Su-35. So now, with regards to Russia's delays with air defense, okay, so it's quite obvious that we have statements from Putin a couple weeks ago at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum talking about, while this conflict was raging, how difficult it was to be a friend to and help Iran. Because despite the strategic partnership that Iran and Russia agreed to last year, the new deepened, strengthened strategic partnership, which, by the way, the Iranian parliament only approved finally after Israel had begun their attacks. But it includes no defense clauses, right? At Iran's refusal, right? which is a shock because most of us assumed that Russia was already beginning the process of building an air defense network for Iran, and that's not the case at all. And he went in further that Russia had offered Iran a mutual defense pact, like with what they signed with North Korea, and Iran said, thank you, but no thank you. And that Russia had also offered coordination on air defense, right? A joint air defense production so that air defense interceptors would even be made as well in Iran, and that Russia would help them build a multi-layered integrated air defense and EW network, and that they would even be hooked up into Russia's own satellite and radar air defense, warning system. And they said, no, thanks, but no thanks. And apparently the reason for this, what we're being told, and I haven't seen it denied by the Iranians at all, is that this was because the Iranian government, again, supposedly, and it makes a degree of sense, Pezeshkian, right, the so-called reformist who ran on a campaign naive as F of placating and improving relations with the West, so that makes a certain amount of sense, that they believed that militarily aligning themselves with Russia, well, Russia was already in a proxy come direct war with the US and NATO in Ukraine, would ruin any chances of Iran improving relations with the West. And get this, might even lead to direct conflict between Iran and the United States. So, I'm sorry, Picard epic double face bomb, right? That's the only reaction. Now, Iran is a prickly nation, all right? They've got a millennia of history, right, behind them as a civilization. That they've got their pride, their sovereignty. And there's some bad history between Russia and Iran, whether that was the Romanov Empire and the Persian Empire, or even in World War II when the Soviet Union and Britain invaded Iran under fears that Iran would side with the Axis powers. And that was brief. What's more is that there had been in a previous agreement around a little bit before and around 2010, say, for Russia to deliver their S-300 air defense system to Iran. A little older, but very formidable still, right? Ukraine was using them to great effect in the beginning year or two of the conflict there until Russia finally got rid of them all. But Russia was going through their own naive phase of believing they could cut a deal, right? That they could ingratiate themselves with the West. This was when Medvedev was president. That was when Medvedev agreed to the UN Security Council resolution that opened the way for, at least in their minds, for the West to dismember Libya, turning it into the failed terrorist state that it is today. But they withheld on the deliveries of these S-100s for years, right? For years before they were finally delivered. And that was out of an attempt to please the U.S. So Iran has, some reasons to distrust Russia, but it must be said that both Russia and China have come a long way in the last decade, since 2015, say, to where they are today. And I think it's obvious to us, right, in the alt media community, that Russia and China and Iran they will either hang and survive together, or they will be hung separately. Right? That's it. That's the options. The U.S. Sees a closing window, geopolitical window of opportunity They wanted to take down Russia first in Ukraine, that the Biden administration, that failed. Now they just made an attempt to take down Iran. This, shall we say, prioritization and strategic sequencing, right? The end game, of course, is to go for China, but they tried to separate China by taking out Russia, and then when that didn't work, Iran next. All U.S. presidents since Obama have been trying to pivot to Asia to confront China, but they've all gotten bogged down, every single one of them, in either the Middle East or now Eastern Europe, with Ukraine and Russia as well. So I really hope that in the aftermath of this, we saw this emergency trip of Aragchi to Moscow. He didn't go to Beijing, he went to Moscow. And the Russians, they didn't, there was no transcript, no readout of what happened, but we did have Peskov saying, how can you help the Iranians? What will you do? And his response was, well, that depends on what they ask for, which seemed a fairly expansive. It wasn't quite, we'll give them whatever they want, but there are some people that are, interpreting that way. Maybe it was, we don't know. But I believe that the Russian government, after the last 5 years, last 10 years, understands that you can't cut deals with the West. You can go through motions, but you can't ever trust them. And hopefully Iran has reached that. But they also need to learn to trust Russia and China. I think that this will become easier if everything is presented as a tripartite, right? Everything is done together. It's not just Iran has to come to an agreement with Russia and depend on and trust Russia, or depend on and trust China, but it all has to be done, the three of them together, right? Mutual defense agreements, strategic agreements, whatever it takes. Because, again, they'll either hang together and survive to found the multipolar world order, or they won't. And we'll have another century of U.S.-led Western global hegemony. That's the game. That is it. And in every other country, North Korea, Syria's gone now. They're bit players on the scene for various, resources, capability, foundations of geopolitical strategy reasons or political will. It comes down to these three, and they're all quite clearly targeted as adversaries by the United States. And we had statements from Kellogg, former General Kellogg, who is Trump's really babysitter for the Kiev regime during already collapsed diplomatic talks on trying to close out the Ukraine conflict on U.S. terms. But Kellogg warned that there was a new geopolitical reality, and that's why the Trump administration was at least trying to consider, not obviously succeeding, but trying to adopt a more realist-based foreign policy viewpoint. Because whereas previously they could deal with Russia and China and Iran separately, that now they were all interconnected together to some ways, and they were working with each other, not to the degree that they need to, right? This needs to be strengthened. But I mean, one of the clear examples of is the U.S. goes after Iran, right? And right away, oil prices started raising. Donald Trump is freaking out and screaming at, I don't know, the market, someone, I'm watching you. You're playing into the hands of the enemy for oil prices rising. And then, it was a few days after that they tapped out of the conflict. Meanwhile, the prices of energy go up and Russia starts, we're in the money, right? The war coffers are full, keep it up. So you go after one of the tripartite, and that has negative effects that exposes the U.S. to vulnerabilities with the other two. They need to strengthen this. They need to trust each other. They need to find ways to trust each other. And the military defense between the three of them, the intelligence defense, the intelligence cooperation, and other degrees of cooperation. I could certainly say that both the Iranian media and the Chinese media could probably take some cooperation with RT and Sputnik under consideration. I mean, supposedly there are already programs of cooperation, but they don't go far enough because, I mean, RT, I got my own issues, right? They've got their petty internal politics and warts and all, but no one can deny how effective they've been in total, right? I mean, the U.S. screams about their effects in Africa and South America and how they're turning the world against them all the time. So that's certainly another degree of cooperation, but it's got to deepen, it's got to strengthen, it's got to become more than just tactical maneuvers. It's got to become deeply institutionally rooted reality. The alliance between Russia and China, Iran. They need to stop getting over this aversion to that terminology, that way of thinking. A long time we've heard, oh, SCO, BRICS. We're not a geopolitical bloc. We're against that type of thinking. Well, you may not have any interest in geopolitical blocs, but meanwhile, the opposing geopolitical bloc, U.S.-led Western global hegemony, they have an interest in you. And you have to either hang together or you'll fall separately. That's it.
Yeah, and it's quite ironic actually that a lot of the reports about Iran potentially bolstering its air power, not necessarily air defenses, with the Chinese aircraft was going on as the defense ministers of the SCO were meeting together. So that message hopefully is starting to make the rounds. But also, Mark, I'm curious about your reaction to some have been surmising that a big reason why Iran was able to have such success with its missile targeting was that it's able to use Chinese GPS, Baidu, for targeting. And this, what is your reaction to this? Your knowledge of these kinds of systems and how it could maybe spell an indication that further cooperation would indeed be a benefit rather than a hindrance, which these three powers often see the alliance kind of fold as being potentially a hindrance to them.
Yeah, I mean, both China's own satellite networks, which are growing in capabilities almost monthly, and Russia's own GLONASS system are extremely capable. And my understanding is that they themselves are increasingly actively sharing and coordinating information, Russia and China, constantly, so that it's difficult even to consider them separate capabilities at this point because there's so much intelligence sharing going on between the two of them, and either one of them can account for what we're hearing now about Israeli laments about how precise at least some of the Iranian strikes with their newer weapons were. And space is just another battlefield now, right? We often think of space only in terms of science fiction and laser guns and that, but satellites, anti-satellite capabilities, I mean, that's the real game right now. Not even so much, kinetic things, weapons, rods from gods, and that sort of things. It's all about satellites and anti-satellite weapons. It's a real thing, and Iran obviously needs help in this category, and that's certainly one of the things that they can't easily get on their own, not in any type of time frame that matters. So we know during the conflict, during this 12-day war, as Trump is calling it, I think it more of as a skirmish, kicking the can down the road till the next outbreak of the conflict. But that Putin and Xi Jinping had an hour and a half phone conversation that they made clear was almost entirely talking about the conflict in the war on Iran. We don't know what they said. We don't know what they agreed to. We don't know what any type of division of duties and labor in assisting Iran might have come down, right? This talk now about the J10. Oh, again, I consider it all rumors. Regardless, whether Iran took the J10 or whether the Iran takes the Su-35, I don't care as long as they take one of them. But actually, I think they need to worry far more about air defense, right? As we're talking about, what that they're getting. They need to talk. They need more intelligence sharing. They need counterintelligence help from Russia and China. They need digital sovereignty, right? They need to get rid of all Western social media networks, or at least put them under much tighter observation and control. They need to get rid of any Western software, hardware in terms of computer systems in their government and military, something that Russia and China have already done to a great degree. They need real digital and electronic sovereignty. And that's something, again, that Russia and China can help them with, because they've only recently come through and struggled through that on their own. And Iran, needs to learn to take help on all of these categories. I would consider counterintelligence and air defense, the top priorities. But I would be surprised, to revisit your actual question, if they did not get satellite targeting data from either China or Russia or both.
Yeah. Mark, before we move on to the next topic, I want your brief reaction to this audience question, because I think they're very eager to ask it. But they said, can you run down the specifics of Iran's obligations under, I don't know about a defense pact, but maybe we're talking about strategic partnership. But they're wondering if support for the resistance, was Putin okay with this? I've never seen any reports on this, but your thoughts and analysis of that situation.
Yeah, we don't know, because no text of the strategic partnership has ever been included. I know a lot of people are online saying, "Oh, Iran only refused because they would have been forced to send troops to fight the Ukrainians," or something, which is just absolutely nonsense, right? Even that did not happen with North Korea, right? Russia made no demands that North Korea send troops to fight in Kursk or anywhere else. The North Koreans eagerly volunteered for that because they wanted the combat experience. They wanted to prove their commitment to this. And I would say that it was probably more than it wasn't a necessity for Russia. They didn't need the manpower, and it might have even been potentially diplomatically and politically more problem than and Russia decided to do it anyway. But there was no demand, there was no commitment there. So I absolutely do not believe that would have been demanded of Israel or of Iran either. With regards to could you toss that question up again?
Oh, sure.
There was something up there. Support for the axis of resistance.
Yeah.
Okay, so it has to be remembered that in just the last year, Russia themselves has openly suggested that they could arm the Houthis with anti-ship weapons in response to the Biden administration lobbying. Now, this is another thing that we haven't talked about, is how that largely the so-called axis of resistance, right? Iran's pro-Shia groups throughout the Middle East that Iran supports, they were a no-show in this. They might as well not have been there. I know the Houthis, the Ansar Allah, fired a few missiles in the direction of Israel through this, but obviously they had been mauled by months of U.S. and Israeli and British strikes on them, and their capability. They survived, which is great, and the U.S. eventually said this is, you know, too expensive, wasting too many, again, air defense interceptors and strike missiles, and we're playing whack-a-mole here is pointless, and they just declared victory and you know, sent their ships away out of range. But that being said, I think it obvious that the Houthis' offensive capabilities took a beating during that, right? Which is still, you know, a credit to them for enduring, you know, assaults by the U.S. and Israel, and not having it dent their sentiments, their morale, their capabilities, their societal cohesion, you know, whatever, and they still made an attempt. But did you hear anything from Hezbollah during this? Did you hear? I mean, Hamas is just fighting for Gazan survival still.
Right.
I didn't hear anything from Kataib Hezbollah over the course of this. Maybe I heard one mortar fired somewhere in Iraq at direction of a U.S. base. This is because prior to this attack, and I'm sure it was intended this way, that Israel went after each one of the axis of resistance in turn. And if they didn't destroy them, they gave them a good beating that took them a long time to recover from. And I have to say that my impression is that under the President Pezeshkian, Iran did very little to lift a finger to help each one of them when Israel was going after them. So I don't think the question is Russia worried politically about Iran's support of the axis of resistance? I think a more pointed question is, what is the real level of the current Iranian government's support for their own axis of resistance?
Yeah. I mean, it's a very complex question because, you know, Iran, I think what we've seen, especially in this latest 12-day, you know, hostilities, the war waged against them, was that Iran is fiercely sovereign. I mean, Pezeshkian and the top officials, people always criticize them, but even at the ranks, it seems like, of their military, they're like fiercely sovereign, like so fiercely sovereign, independent, that maybe some would criticize too sovereign, too independent, too averse to cooperating with, you know, Russia. They really want to rely on indigenous capabilities. This was something that was almost like 10 toes down kind of statements coming out of Iran during this. So there's also this. There's also the you know, how the approach is militarily, politically to these questions.
It's absolutely understandable. Again, Iran has a millennia-long history of civilization, wanting to maintain their sovereignty and independence and relying on their own capabilities is in a way commendable, and at the same time has obviously been taken to a degree where it caused severe damage to Iran in a military confrontation with the West, and has obviously been taken too far. Their prickliness, their pride, their mistrust of others nearly led to a fatal conceit. And like I said, Russia and China and Iran, it's not just a problem with Iran, right? Russia, China, and Iran need to find a way to more fully trust and integrate with the others. Yes, that is going to mean a certain degree of sacrifice of sovereignty. That is true of any institution, whether we're talking BRICS Plus to a very limited degree, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization also limited, but NATO. Look how much sovereignty European countries give up to the United States and NATO. At least there is a more level, a more even playing field between Russia and China and Iran than, say, between the United States and, I don't know, Belgium, you know, for instance. So there is less of a degree of sovereignty. That is a trade-off, and of any type of military or broader political alliance. And again, if you want to die on the horse, the proud hill of sovereignty and independence to an extreme degree, that's fine. I mean, there is a commendable sentiment there, but I think strictly in pragmatic, realist, strategic terms, it has already been taken too far, and that the Iranian government needs to make a reassessment and find ways that they can cooperate and integrate to a much higher degree with Russia and China. And again, Russia and China have they should be learning the same lessons from this, I would hope.
Yeah, and just a couple of points, and then I want to move on to the next
Good question.
subject. Because it's a great question. I think one, for the axis of resistance in particular, I feel like we've seen Iran take this posture over and over again, and we should be believing them when they say that they are not directly creating and sponsoring and essentially forming these organizations and resistance formations, that they are truly, they give support, but they have said over and over again that no, Ansar Allah, Hamas, whatever it is, they're relying a lot on their own indigenous capabilities, maybe. And so that, I think, is Hezbollah. It's always been the truth. And then that, I think, also speaks to how much can Iran really do to bolster them, but also that all of them kind of understand, and I think they've been understanding from the very beginning, that they are in a years-long, maybe decades-long war of attrition that is going to, who knows where it goes, but that is what they are essentially gambling on, maybe without any other choice in the matter. And then the second point,
Let me jump in there for a second. So first of all, in terms of proxies, I think, let's take Hezbollah. They quite obviously developed in response, in Lebanon to Israeli on their own. And yes, Iran gave them support, but Iran did not create Hezbollah to the same extent, if we're talking quote unquote proxies, that the U.S. created an anti-Russian putsch regime in Ukraine, right? If we want to make proxy comparisons there. I think that under the current government of Pezeshkian, and after joining BRICS Plus and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, that the Iranian government has made the decision itself to draw a degree of political and military remove between themselves and the axis of resistance. I think they made that decision. We can talk about whether it's the right or the wrong decision, but I know that I've heard people making the argument from within Iranian academic and government sources. There is an ongoing conversation is, why are we sacrificing ourselves, our interests, making enemies, trying to save or even be a gadfly in the process of against the Israeli genocide of Palestinians, when all of the Arab countries in the Middle East aren't lifting a finger? And that I don't see as any degree of lack of sympathy or change, in ideological orientation from Iran, simply a more realist, pragmatic, and cold-blooded assessment. I've said it on my own channel. I'll say it here. It's a black pill that a lot of people don't want to hear. But the Palestinians are a doomed people. The Israelis are bent on genocide and ethnic cleansing and the forging of a greater Israel. The United States has been quietly complicit in this slow-moving policy for decades. But now under the Trump administration and somewhat under the Biden administration as well, or the Blinken-Sullivan administration, this has been accelerated and greenlit to an absolutely unimaginable. Trump talking about, once all the people are gone, turning it into Gaza into a vacation resort. And there is no power on this earth at this time, not Russia, not China, not Ansar Allah, and not Iran, that can save the Palestinian people. The US and Israel are both nuclear powers. They both have escalation dominance. Russia and China do not have the military power to geopolitically power project into the Middle East to save the Palestinians. They politically support them. They recognize Palestine as a state. They will condemn the US, but ultimately the Palestinians people in the fate of the US president, and the US president, who, I mean, whatever, it doesn't make any difference whether it's Trump or Biden or whatever else. You know, the US course is set. The Palestinian people are going to end up being a nomadic people, much like, ironically, the Jews themselves once were. Not only will they not have a state, they will not have a homeland. And it seems inevitable at this point. It's happening before our eyes, and people don't want to recognize that fact yet. I think there is probably a reluctant but grudging and cold-blooded calculation being realized in factions within the Iranian government as well, that it's a losing cause. And if you want to fight a losing cause, I don't have a problem with that. I believe in fighting for lost causes. But when you're in charge of the national interests of a state, you have to make some cold-blooded and hard decisions. And I think that decision is being made in more countries than just Iran at this point. And again, that's a black pill that a lot of people don't want to eat.
I mean, it's a perspective too. I mean, it's an approach too. It's a political question. You know, there's definitely, I can't imagine these debates are not had within Iran's political system. Only because, you know, there are many, I would assume, in Iran, you know, and I think I fall on this, that, you know, Palestine is a key question. It's you know, it's about national liberation. You got to stand up for the people. It's an effort worth fighting for. It's one that might
ideological argument.
Yeah, it might not.
Not a national interests argument.
Right, exactly. It might be decades down the line, but a lot of people, even now a lot of people around the world, see this as an existential and a key question for a whole lot of things. But then there's, of course, as you said, Mark, there's how about the right now? How do we maneuver this right now? It's all very difficult. And I think the same goes with the Russia, China, Iran partnership too, because you know, I think one of the things that I'm always watching out for is how deep can this partnership get before a crisis, because it's difficult to just turn on anything during a crisis. It's you know, military partnership, cooperation alliance, these things do not just speed up when a crisis happens. It is really key, I believe, that any kind of hesitancy on any of the sides be worked out, because eventually, I think all of them should be very well aware, the U.S., Israel, the U.S. and its vassals, whatever, they're not afraid to create a crisis in rapid fashion, regardless of whether it'll go well for them or not.
Yeah,
that's not
whether
even,
it makes strategic sense or not. Yeah,
no.
we see two of them right now. We're in two of those crises, and right now, Russia and China and Iran have done a fairly commendable job of stumbling through them. But again, they need to increase their coordination and integration in dealing with these things. And
well, Mark, I would like your brief. Let's get to Ukraine, and then we can finish. There's a lot of audience questions we can get to at the very end here. But how about we spend some portion, 20 minutes or so, 15, 20 minutes, however long you need, to go over what's happening on the Ukraine front. We have reports from CNN, for example, saying 100,000 Russian troops are amassed are in and around Pokrovsk. This is the next key battle. There's all these reports about Ukraine hitting Russian airliners and jets. And it seems like also we had this very, very strange NATO summit that had a lot of, I think, people confused around the actual relationship between Donald Trump and Europe and Donald Trump and NATO, because it was very friendly. very warm. And while Trump is, of course,
No,
double
it
talking as he
wasn't.
always.
No, it wasn't.
Well, that's why I'm curious your thoughts, because that was on its face. It seemed Donald Trump was so happy. He got his 5%. Ruto was calling him daddy. And then you had, of course, double talk from Trump around Patriots. So your assessment of where the overall situation is right now, though?
Yeah, with this NATO summit, I mean, this is fascinating. You know, one of the things that I've always tossed about Trump as a chaos bomb, right? And the question is just where that bomb goes off. And I had thought that one of the sure bets of where that one place that chaos bomb would go off is the transatlantic relationship, right? The relationship between the US and the European states, particularly as embodied in NATO, right? Because we saw it during the first Trump administration, and everyone agreed that time and since that did considerable damage to the transatlantic relationship. Doesn't mean NATO fell apart, right? Quite obviously, but damage was done. And that seemed a sure bet to happen again. But the European elites have adopted a new strategy for dealing with Trump. Being obsequious and servile sycophants to an almost unfathomable degree in an attempt to please and assuage Trump's narcissistic ego, right? He demands that he be paid court to, right? It's not a meeting of allies. It's everyone comes to Trump's court and pays tribute and courts Trump. And that's what the Europeans have done. They're just playing along with it. And Mark Rutte's incredible posterior licking display, right? I don't consider that actual friendship, right? Or sincerity in any way. It is absolutely the opposite of that. It is complete insincerity. Rachel Marsden wrote she's a writer. Sometimes I agree with, sometimes I don't, who frequently writes for RT. She called it the biggest and priciest humiliation fetish ever put on, which I think is just brilliant because that actually describes what it was. The French political commentator and substacker Arnaud Bertrand, he called it the single biggest humiliation for the dignity of the European continent, right? What happened there? This daddy, and the way the Trump administration, even the White House, then adopted it. Daddy, like the humiliation of the Europeans was used as fodder and entertainment for the U.S. domestic masses, and I can't argue with that at all. I don't think that it was sincere, though. I think it's just a way of managing and trying to manipulate Trump. This 5% spending is not going to happen. More than half of the NATO countries still aren't even spending 2%, much less 5%. And those that will try to reach that 5% will only do so with massively increased debt, like evidently Germany intends to do. Whether they're actually able to hold that coalition government together and do that is another stat. So, on the other hand, during this summit, there was no meetings about Ukraine. There was no military fundraising. There was no economic fundraising. Zelensky was there, even kind of wearing a suit, kind of black thing instead of his usual. But he was just there as like window dressing on the side. He didn't get anything. He didn't achieve anything. So I don't really take this NATO summit very seriously. In fact, it was also almost farcical, I would say. And the results of it do not really strengthen NATO. And Russia has been quite clear that they don't see any decision made there, any talk about NATO spending. They don't even see it as a military threat. And I think that is a realistic assessment of the chances of even if the European countries did all really actually commit to spending 5% of their GDP almost the way the European the scattered military industrial complexes and their own forms of corruption work, all of that, the vast majority of that money would just be sunk into nothing that actually improves the actual compatibility of the European states in a measurable degree anyway. They are well past that in their state of deterioration and decay.
Yeah. Mark, talk about the battlefield situation. We don't hear much about this because of all that's been happening in West Asia. But how is that actually going? Because, of course, Western mainstream media reports are focused solely and heavily on Ukraine's sabotage attacks and various drone attacks on Russian.
Okay, so I mean, the asymmetric attacks are going to continue. The terrorism, the unconventional warfare, increasingly that is going to become the playbook as they become incapable of doing anything. What we saw over the past week is a few days where there was an attempt at Ukrainian counterattacks in a few places, including around Sumy and the Pokrovsk area, a few others. These were almost 100% guaranteed, ordered for political reasons because of this stupid NATO summit and Zelensky thinking it would somehow impress Trump, and they had to show they were still fighting in something. And these counterattacks were already exhausted and reversed, and the Syrskyi declared victory and that he stabilized the front, even as the Russian forces are rolling right past and taking new territory. So it's increasingly grim for the Kiev regime on the battlefield. They don't have any manpower. They don't have any experienced troops left. They don't have any officer corps. There are comments from Ukrainian commanders talking about how now even assaults are committed with the counterattacks, like assaults are committed with the bussified, i.e. forced conscripts with no training and no real offensive ability. They don't even have drones at this point. They don't have artillery. They don't have artillery shells. They're not getting anything from the U.S. The Washington Post is openly, was the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal? Maybe the Wall Street Journal, that the Ukrainian economy without U.S. propping it up is on the brink of complete economic and total collapse. There was more reports. Russia took Shevchenko this week, which is the Ukraine's biggest and potentially most lucrative lithium deposit, something that was essentially promised to Trump in the complete nonsense resources deal that, well, if he wants that lithium, he's not going to be dealing with the Kiev regime anymore. Was that WAPO or Wall Street
Washington
Journal?
Post? Yes, Washington
Post. I was right the first time. All right, so things are not looking good. There was the Ukrainian intelligence put out this week while lamenting the amount of Garan, right? These long-range strike drone attacks, and we're well past. I mean, they still call them Shahed 136. They're way past that. I mean, they've gone through military evolutions after evolutions. They're now jet powered. They carry 6 times the payload. I mean, they're just a mean war of destruction tool now. And the Kiev regime warned that Russia by the autumn is going to be producing and using 700 of them a day. Russia is making so many of them now that they're no longer using them just for long-range strike capability. They're using them to clear out the Ukrainian rear along with fab bombs, which is to say they're using them essentially on an operational and tactical level, not just a strategic level, because they've got so many of them at this point. That is the Russian military-industrial complex, the war of attrition. They're starting to have their tolls. And one of the reasons that you're not hearing about the conflict in Ukraine right now is the distraction with the far more important to U.S. domestic political interests, right, with Israel. Thou shalt not mistake the mistress for the wife, right? But the other side of that is how bad things are going for the Kiev regime on the battlefield, and no one wants to talk about it. Trump doesn't even want to engage with it. And I'm sure a big part of that is because there's no victory for him there. There's no win. He can't leverage Putin. He can't bluff and bluster and demand that Russia agree to a deal on his terms. He's already tried that and failed. So he's going to look for his victories or declared victories elsewhere where it's easier. Now, at least up to a point. Eventually, there's going to be more and more pressure on him to re-engage, to double down on Biden's policies. Maybe it's when Russia crosses the Dnieper River. Maybe it's when they move on Kiev. Who knows what that point is going to be. But right now, there still seems to be a pretty strong level of disinterest and disengagement on Trump's part. And it's telling. It's telling on the battlefield. It's telling, by Zelensky's increasing, insane pronouncements and decisions. It's not clear that I don't think the conflict is necessarily going to end this year, but it's going to be harder and harder for the Western media to ignore what's happening there on the battlefield come later in this summer and in the autumn, because the Russian offenses we'll start to see real, if I don't necessarily think collapsing, but we're going to see real localized crumbling of the Kiev regime defenses and forces in multiple areas. Pokrovsk is just one of them, Pokrovsk and Konstantinovka, because it's essentially one area now. There's a big offensive going on in the south in Zaporozhye in the direction of Tokmak and Orehov right now. There's still the Sumy offensive going on that the Kiev regime can't stop there. There's also big things in the direction of Liman, everywhere. Right, Russia is advancing everywhere along the front, and all these counterattacks exhausting the Kiev regime's forces. All they managed to do was slow Russia down for about 2 or 3 days for ridiculous political reasons. But they've always fought that war instead of the real war.
What do you make of the comments, the double talk from Trump himself about Putin in particular? Because on the one hand, during the summit, he was saying Putin is so difficult. He might actually be the big problem here. He wants to take all of Ukraine. And then it's not just a few days later that he's saying, Putin and I were so close. Oh, maybe we're going to continue talks very soon. What do you make of this? How does this demonstrate to you it seems like a very confused and also an attempt to, while continuing the conflict, because of course the U.S. can't disengage from the Ukraine conflict without Ukraine collapsing, but a disengagement in the sense that it's almost like it's being sidelined and subordinated in the PR front. So what do you make of these comments, Mark?
Yeah, psychologists are going to have their work out trying to decipher, Trump's, truths and statements, right? No ceasefire, total unconditional surrender for Iran. Oh, I demand a ceasefire, right? We're peace and the end of hate, and then regime change, and then peace and the end of hate, and then bomb Iran, right? I mean, Trump just goes back and forth. There's no coherent foreign policy in the Trump administration, within Trump himself. Now, several of the people around him are obviously trying to direct him in certain ways, right? Radcliffe, Rubio, Waltz previously, others, to varying degrees. They all have agendas to push. They all have their own priorities, whether it's Iran or Russia or China, right? But Trump is, difficult. He has the intellectual and emotional maturity of a child, and that tells in his, wild schizophrenic swings in one direction or the other, whether it's about Putin or about the Ayatollah Khamenei or anything else. I think we need, as entertaining as these social media pronouncements are, I think we probably, as analysts, need to sit back from them and judge U.S. actions over a longer time frame than the 12 hours it takes for Trump to pivot 180 degrees from one position to another in his latest unhinged emotional outburst on social media. But I think you're right. There is a level of disinterest and disengagement from Ukraine, because he can't spin this into a victory. I mean, not only can he not achieve a victory, he can't even spin it into a victory. The way he can narratively manage what happened in Yemen or in Iran as victories. That's a lot harder to do in this particular situation. So for the moment, what becomes stronger, Trump's disinterest or Trump's frustration? Because both of them, they can overlap and they could have synergistic effects, or they could have, counter effects against each other. We're going to have to see. Again, there's going to be more and more pressure applied on Trump to re-engage. Right now, there isn't a level of engagement. And, whatever he thinks of Putin or not, I mean, Putin is still playing the game. Putin made statements in the last week. Oh, the Russia respects the U.S. again. It's not posterior licking to the same degree as Mark Rutte, but it is a pretty shameless attempt at playing to Trump's narcissism and to manipulate him. It's a little more dignified than what we're seeing from the Europeans, but only a bit, right? I mean, I think we've seen a little more, right? I think that Putin is the president and has to maintain a diplomatic level and deal with the U.S. Medvedev is the bad cop. He's the one playing Zhirinovsky 2.0. So if you want to hear what they're really saying in the Kremlin about Trump, listen to what Medvedev posts about Trump, not to what Putin's official statements are.
Yeah, I can imagine that in the Russian government, there's very little sentiment shared with what Putin said, or at least how he was quoted. Not sure if it's 100% accurate of a translation or quote, but that Trump is a courageous man, who survived these assassinations and all of this. I don't know how that much.
It's about as sincere as Mark Rutte saying, "Oh, you've come from one success to another," right?
And you got a big win coming, right? So, Mark, lastly on Ukraine, then, a good friend Brian Berletic's on the show a lot, and he brings up this point I think about a lot. Yeah, our very good joint friend. He brings up this point a lot. I'm curious on your thoughts about it. Finally, as we enter this summer phase, intensifying, you said offenses coming, but localized, and that the conflict may not finish this year. So does Russia have any concern or have any need to worry about the overall trajectory here? Because this is, as you said, it's going to last for quite a long time. And I'm curious, if you see any possible limitations or issues that Russia may face in the near future, given the prolonged nature of this war now entering, we're going into year 4, as we enter the second half of 2025.
Sure. I mean, there's constant concerns, right? I mean, this is an existential conflict. Russia cannot take their eye off the ball or relax for a second, no matter how much things are going in their direction, right? In a war of attrition now. Look what happened in Syria. They won the war and lost the peace, right? In practically overnight. So there can be no complacency. This has to be seen through the end. And statements that Putin has made this week, which were only really slightly blown out of proportion in the Western media, but he did say things, right? He quoted a Russian historical maxim that wherever a Russian soldier goes, that place is Russia. That's pretty imperialist. I mean, let's be honest there. And he also made comments that because Russia and Ukraine he regards them as the same country, right? The same people, I should say, the same people, that he basically said, you could consider all of Ukraine ours. Those are pretty big statements. And I think that Russia at this point they've given up on diplomacy with Kiev, with the United States. And this is certainly not what they want, they are faced with the possibility that they may have to go to Kiev and beyond and may have to occupy all of Ukraine, not because they wanted to at the start of this conflict or even that they want to now, but simply that the Europeans, the Americans, the Banderites and the Kiev regime are giving them no choice. There are only bad options, and this is a bad option for Russia, but it's the least bad option to having a Ukrainian rump state turned into a NATO battle platform against Russia, into the future and to the next war. So there's a degree of confidence, but it is very cautious, fully cognizant that Russia can't make any mistakes. They can't let their guard down for a single second, because this is not going to be over anytime soon. And Russia is going to have their economic and political strength tested to the limit, as well as their military strength, by having to deal with absorbing much or perhaps all of Ukraine. The rebuilding costs of trying to not only rebuild Ukraine, but then bring it up to Russian living standards is just mind-boggling. Russia doesn't have that money. I don't know where they're going to get that. I don't know. It's daunting. It is extremely daunting. And no, China's not going to come to the rescue and drop trillions of dollars in Russia's lap for the reconstruction of Ukraine either. Yeah, Chinese are far too good businessmen for that kind of charity. So there's of course a lot of concerns. There's also concerns about the Kiev regime's openly proclaimed now in the Washington Post, with Ignatius talking about the dirty war has just begun, right? The war of terrorism and assassinations and unconventional warfare. We have the Europeans working to create some type of pretext or false flag in the Baltic, creating some type of naval incident that could potentially, be used to try to force the U.S. back into direct conflict with Russia. There's all kinds of these games going on in and around Russia, in Ukraine, but also at other potential flashpoints around Russia. That it's a constant, not only a game of chess, but also a tightrope walk to avoid the potentially world-shattering spiral of escalation.
And yes, all right, Mark. Let's get to a few questions as we close out here. There are a few ones. Here's one that I think is good for you. Would it be best for Russia to send S-300s instead of S-400s to Iran, since there'd be little or no learning curve, or gradually implementing and training Iran for S-400s, or better?
Well, in reality, they should both be sent, right? I mean, that's the point of a multi-layered, integrated, interconnected, whatever is available, right? So Iran already has some experience with the S-300s. But saying there would be little to no learning curve is also not true, because they more of them. They mean more troops that need to be trained to that level. But always, Russia uses a range of short range and long range and intermediate range overlapping air defense and electronic warfare systems. You've got the TORs, you've got a numerous other systems. It's not just one system or the other. It's all systems. It is a multi-layered, integrated, interconnected network using capabilities that Iran already has, using new capabilities, or working them in bit by bit as they become available. And right now, there's a real question: how many S-400s can Russia even send to Iran? Right? Some probably they can spare, but they're in an existential conflict with NATO. And until that conflict is over, the Russian military, of course, takes priority on export orders, even to allies. So what they have available to provide to Iran, if Iran said, we need S-400s tomorrow, right? Again, learning the system, implementing it, integrating it, that's another thing. A system on its own has a certain amount of defensive capability, but is only a fraction of what that is when it is a part of an integrated, interconnected, multi-layered network, right? When it becomes vastly more effective. So one individual system on its own is only so much good. And it will take years to build up an Iranian. And the Iranians are going to want to be, if they agree for help, are going to want to be, fully engaged and doing production on their own territory and everything at every step of that process. And maybe they'll decide that the Chinese, which have analog systems to the Russians, using some of the same systems, using some of their own reverse engineered or, of the like. And I'm sure the Chinese have made their own air defense developments that, because they haven't been battle tested yet, we're not necessarily aware of, right? That are only theoretical and on paper at this point. Maybe some Chinese systems might be even better. Maybe what Iran needs is an integration of Russia and Chinese systems, right? To the best extent that they can be put together into an integrated network. It's not an easy question to answer. They need S-300s, they need S-400s, they need a lot of other short and long range and medium range systems. It's not one magic pill. We're just all familiar with the S-300 and S-400 because they get mentioned in the media more than anything else. But there's a lot of other systems that Russia is using effectively, short range, medium range, on the battlefield as part of their defense networks every day. So don't neglect those other systems as well. Maybe I should do a deep dive focus in more Russian air defense systems. I've already did one on the electronic warfare systems, and that went on for months and got paid very little attention to people a couple of years ago, unfortunately. So it's a military gear question, and we can talk about it, but we also maybe need to take a step back and consider it more at a strategic and geopolitical level, what's going on, rather than the nitty gritty of leaving which system is better suited for Iran right now to the Russian and Iranian military specialists themselves.
All right. So just quickly, two more here. Here's Sparky again. I thought this was not this one, actually. Let me ask you this one. Did the U.S. at some point in history make an agreement with Israel where Israel's nukes can only be used if the U.S. agrees with an Israeli key in an American or weapon? Anyway, I don't know what W/A means, but
yeah. I don't know. I don't know if that's true. I've never heard that. I certainly have no proof of that. I've never even heard of anyone mentioning that. So I doubt that anyone knows the answer to that question. My guess is I would doubt it because I think that Israel is very prickly about their degree of nuclear sovereignty. The nuclear weapon that they got was not from the United States. It was not transferred from the United States. It was transferred from France and potentially other countries. I think the U.S. has a lot of political influence and pull over Israel. But then again, Israel also has a lot of political influence and pull over the U.S. People always want to say, the U.S. is the master and is using Israel as a geopolitical tool. No, Israel is the master, and it's really the Jewish IPAC community, a conspiracy really running the United States as the puppet masters. It's not so clear cut as that. They are synergistic relationships that influence and reinforce, and one thing is to the U.S. interests, but it's also to Israeli interests and vice versa. So I can't give you a clear, yes or no on that particular question. Does the U.S. control the nuclear key for Israel? I would doubt it, but they would also probably have considerable political say, without having a control key over Israel using a nuclear weapon.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. The whole dog wagging the tail, tail wagging the dog. It's
It's
I
both.
think exactly. We're seeing, I think, the synergy. People have to remember Israel was not necessarily created by the United States. It's not a creation of a U.S. backed coup, and the leverage that
The
each
Soviet
asserts on each
Union
other.
was one of the biggest the early promoters of
Right.
Israel and the first
Of
country to
course,
actually arm it.
of course.
Historical mistakes.
Yes, and of course British, and we know how the leverage. We can just see how the leverage asserted on each other is really all about how their interests are working in alignment. And I truly believe that the U.S. actually is willing to sacrifice very menial kinds of interests that it has to achieve larger objectives. So if Israel can certainly be a huge cog in the wheel that creates regime change in Iran, for example, or can facilitate that, then the U.S. will do a lot to make that happen. So I think that's why it often looks like in the United States that Israel is kind of the one turning the key. A lot of people, though, unfortunately miss the fact that the U.S. has a deep interest in a lot of what Israel wants as well. And I think that's the big problem.
Joe Biden famously saying, if Israel didn't exist, we'd have to create it.
Exactly. And here you have, this kind of gets into this question too, Mark. You can answer this quickly. Would Iran get an umbrella to actual parity in the Middle East if the U.S. was sovereign, and if would it yank Israel's nukes and spread the nuclear umbrella? I mean, this is a very hypothetical question, but your thoughts? Oops, sorry.
If U.S. was sovereign, it would have yanked Israel's nukes and spread its nuclear umbrella. Okay, I don't actually agree with that. And then would Iran get an umbrella to get actual parity in the Middle East? Okay, so, I mean, there is an ongoing debate, a very heated debate within the factions of the Iranian government that is now almost certainly more heated than ever about should we get a strategic deterrent or not. Quite obviously, there was a strategy that by being a threshold state, right, technically in compliance with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and international law, by having 60% enriched uranium, which there was nothing preventing, but that is clearly not in the spirit, shall we say. Why does Iran need 60% enriched uranium? It doesn't, except as a partial strategic deterrent. The idea that Iran could, if they wanted to, quickly develop a nuclear weapon with what they already have done was conceived of as a medium step between getting a nuclear weapon and not having one. Obviously, it is a stratagem that has completely failed. There was also the belief that by having that much enriched uranium, they could leverage that in diplomatic talks with the US and Europe to get sanctions removed and the like. Obviously, that hasn't worked either. So Iran, now has a choice. Do they want to more immediately expose themselves to more attacks, or is the path that North Korea has taken in getting a strategic deterrent the avenue to follow? And I can't answer that question, and a lot is dependent not just on what has happened with North Korea or Iraq or Libya, but the particular situation with Iran, which will be dealt with undoubtedly at a different contextual level by the United States. Now, the question of an unofficial umbrella, that is, shall we say, Russia's nuclear umbrella extended over Iran. Would that provide a countervailing force and allow Iran to not go down the path of building their own nuclear weapon? I think Russia would like that very much, right? That is why Russia has pushed a mutual defense pact. They would prefer, out of other proliferation concerns, i.e. Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt potentially following down the same path, that Iran accepts that Russia and China could provide them with their own type of conventional deterrent in the forms of air defense and electronic warfare, right? Which Iran already previously turned down. Now, if a mutual defense agreement was signed between Russia and Iran, like Russia had suggested, I do not believe there would be an explicit clause in there, right? It would not be spelled out that Russia's nuclear umbrella was extended to Iran, but you can implicitly make that assumption. If Russia was treaty bound to come to Iran's defense if they were attacked, and Russia is a nuclear superpower, then by default, going to war with them means going to war with a nuclear superpower that does have nuclear weapons. So even if it's not spelled out in fact, it is implicitly and de facto a reality. Whether this will be enough to satisfy Iran's sovereignty and security concerns, I can't tell you. I think Russia would be up for that. I don't know if the Iranian government will come to the same conclusion.
Mark, it's been great today. In the video description, and you can provide maybe 30 seconds of where people can find you in the video description. I do have your Boosty account because I know that you are promoting this. Everyone can find you and support you there. Maybe you want to talk about that for just 30 seconds about what that is and how people can support you.
Sure. Boosty is a sanctions-proof Patreon equivalent. You can find me there. It's BOOSTY. Therealpolitick or Mark Sleboda. You can find me on both, and I have exclusive content 3 times a week there, plus a private Discord community where we share information and talk and chat, and you can engage with me on the voice chats and potentially have private interviews with me and the like. So please come and support me there. You can also find me on the evil American oligarch Elon Musk's Twitter X at Mark Sleboda 1 and on Telegram and Substack, non-supportive.
Of course. Well, everybody in the video description, also you can find all the places you can follow and support this work, Patreon, Substack, and so much more. Hit the like button before you go. I am back tomorrow, actually, 1 p.m. Eastern, with Dr. Mohammed Marandi to get more insight into the funeral and everything that's happening right now in Iran. Mark, it's been great to be with you. We're going to head out together. Everybody hit the like button before you go. That continues to boost our conversation after it is done. Take care and see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
До свидания.